Well, thank you everyone again. So for joining today's webinar with Dr. Mitchell D. Rosario, who is a PhD. This month's webinar is entitled The MSL, A Bridge Between Science and Medicine in Product Lifecycle. So as a quick introduction, Mitch got his PhD in 2015 as a senior MSL who's a senior MSL right now at Genentech. He has extensive experience supporting a wide range of treatments from phase 1 through 4, including ocular surgical devices, biologics, and oral inhibitors. He's also had some previous training as a postdoctoral fellow in doing myelation research at WashU School of Medicine. And there he received a prestigious NIH F32 fellowship. He earned his PhD studying synapses biology and was selected as his graduate commencement speaker. In his free time, Mitch is really enjoying spending time with his two young boys and completing a part-time MPH at the University of Illinois, Chicago. So with that, I'd love to open it up to Mitch. We just thank you for coming on today's webinar. And if you don't mind kind of sharing a little bit more about your background and your experience in medical affairs, now that we've heard a little bit about your story.
Sure thing, Sonia. Thank you so much, Sonia and Gavin, for this opportunity. Really excited to be here to share my story with all of you, answer any questions that you might have, and have a really good discussion, right? Like this should be a discussion between all of us. Ask me questions that you have. Share your experiences if you've been looking into MSL roles. Really want to hear from you guys. A little bit about myself and how I came to be an MSL. I started off in academia, started off as a PhD, had a postdoc. I was going into the academic route, had an F32, and something happened. My lab decided to move from St. Louis to Portland, Oregon. And at that time, we were expecting our first child, and moving to Oregon wasn't in the books for me. So as a postdoc, I started asking myself, what do I do? What I did was I took the grant and then moved into a different lab. But in doing so, I also reached out to a lot of people in industry, asking them, what kind of jobs are there where I can be remote and live where I want to be and still be part of pharma. So as a true scientist, I reached out to 130 MSLs and MSL managers all over LinkedIn. I send them either LinkedIn messages, I send them combinations of their first and last name at whatever company they were at. And out of that, only 30 people responded back. And all 30 of them, the people that responded back, I built a relationship with some of them. Some of those turned into referrals for jobs and interviews. And we'll talk about that as well. And from there, I actually got my first break in a small cap ophthalmology company. And then I switched over to Genentech, Roche, and here I've been for about 4 years now. I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. Very inspiring story for our audience members who might be at similar stages of their training and really contemplating the moves that you made. And so kind of the follow-up question to that, now that we know a little bit about your journey, what aspects in kind of reaching out to those 130 people and those discussions that you were having with MSLs or MSL managers, what about those informational interviews really solidified that this was going to be the right career for you?
It was, so as a bench scientist, a lot of the molecules that I was working on were things that may or may not have fruition in 20 years. Whereas in industry, you're working on molecules that might have an impact immediately. Like you might have a product that you're supporting that might get launched next month and, would be treated, patients would be treated with it. So that being on the bleeding edge of science is really exciting, as well as if you're at a company that has a large enough portfolio, you're supporting multiple molecules across different stages of development. And that's something that's exciting. So I think that one aspect of it, the scientific curiosity that comes with the role, the ability to talk to different people across different processes of treating patients, and how you can change your message depending on who they are, is something that was really interesting for me.
That's excellent. Yeah, and I hope it resonates with some folks in the audience as well. And so I think a theme of what we've been doing with our most recent webinars is really understanding more about that role, because that's a very central part of the interview process, and even just knowing if you're interested in being an MSL. And so that's why this month's webinar is focusing in on understanding how the MSL functions in different stages of a product. So we'd like to start with that first question of just understanding how exactly the process of drug commercialization works. And if you don't mind walking through the path, especially since you've been involved in kind of that phase 1 all the way through for just kind of how the steps of that process work.
Sure. So in a product cycle for a drug, they go through stages. It starts off in early development. So this is something where the scientists from the bench have actually identified a target, and they want to do first in human trials, right? So the first phase 1, phase 2 oftentimes are, phase 1 is definitely where you're looking at the safety profile, and you're trying to see if this is something that would be applicable moving forward. Are the benefits better than the risks involved? Phase 1, phase 2 are very early stages. This is a smaller number of patients that you're trying out. You're using the drug for trials. Based on the signal that you have, then you move into later stages of clinical development. These are phase 3 trials, but before that, I think there's a lot of risk involved as well. If you are an MSL supporting an early development drug, it is likely that you might fail. There's a 1 in 10 chance that you will be successful. So being aware of that is really important. And then using those learnings, right? Like learning from the investigators about their experiences in the early clinical trials and sharing it back with the company is really important. So MSLs or medical science liaison play kind of like a vital link between the science of medicine, because we're talking about the molecule, the science, the pathways that it affects, and the art of medicine, how it's going to be used in practice. Then you come into the later stages of clinical development. Phase 3 is larger trials. It's often random. It's randomized. Often has a control arm, which is the standard of care, and the goal of it is to see the safety and efficacy of your drug that you're studying. Compare that to the standard of care treatment. What's really important here to remember as an MSL is that MSLs are not sales representatives, right? You're not part of the commercial arm. And so here, what you want to do is you want to make sure that your messaging to the investigators and the therapeutic area experts are unbiased and accurate. So making sure that you're looking into your FAQs or whatever documents you have, and you're actually relaying information. And if you don't know the information, to let them know that you don't. After phase 3, let's say your molecule has a good safety profile and a good efficacy, that is when you go into the regulatory approval stage. And this is where MSL roles might be different from other field medical roles. Depending on the companies that you're in, you might be involved. If you're in a smaller company, you might be involved in speaking with regulators or presenting to them. In larger companies, you have something called managed care experts, who are field medical individuals who can talk to professionals who are kind of like the regulators for different hospital systems. Finally, you have launch, which is probably the most exciting part. This is when you have a new molecule that you've been supporting for trials, and it's being launched. So this is more about educating both academic and community HCPs. One of the key things here is that it's also important to report adverse events as you hear them in a timely fashion. Oftentimes in clinical trials, these are needed information. These are something that is always relayed. But in launch mode, this is something that is the onus and the responsibilities on the MSL. If they hear that there's an adverse event with the molecule after it's been marketed, to share that with the company and document it. I cannot emphasize enough the fact that this industry is heavily regulated, and a lot of the things that we do is heavily regulated. And so the MSLs at this stage should be able to adapt and be compliant throughout the whole process. And then finally, there's the post-launch stage. This is more about a mature product that has been in the market for a long time. This is where you kind of are building relationships with different therapeutic area experts, learning new things that they're hearing, learning for new things that you can hear from these experts as they have been using your product. These are also maybe opportunities where you might have investigator-initiated trials where they want to use the molecule for a different therapeutic indication. And in this case, it's really important to provide, again, being that that source of information for the investigators that is unbiased and non-promotional. I'll stop there.
Excellent. Yeah, no, those are wonderful kind of keywords for people to kind of jot down and really understand the whole spectrum from pre-launch to launch and where the MSL fits there. And so while extremely comprehensive, it might seem a little overwhelming to someone who's not necessarily involved in each one of those steps. Can you explain to us how an MSL can get trained to be effective in all the functions that you kind of mentioned?
I think you learn by drinking by the hose, right? It's something that you are always learning, depending on what stage your company is at. I've been very lucky to have good mentors and teammates who have trained me. You learn from them. Sometimes you learn from your own mistakes, right? And seeing where you could have done things differently. I always think that as an MSL, even though it's a field remote role, it's really important for you to have a tribe of people supporting you. So building like a connection of people remotely, digitally, that you can connect with and ask for support and feedback. So I'll stop there. Does that answer your question, Sonia?
Yeah, that's wonderful to know that you're gonna have a plentiful resources to fall back on and people to reach out to. We had a great question that kind of follows up on what you mentioned just now. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what it means to support a drug or a molecule? What is the concept of supporting really entail as an MSL?
Right. So supporting could entail answering questions that a provider might have of a molecule. So what it may this requires collaboration between commercial and medical. So it might be that a provider has a question about a molecule and they reach out to the sales representative and ask them that question. There's situations where these questions may not be on label. So sales representatives, commercial colleagues can only talk about on-label materials. That's on the, and by on-label, I mean what's on the PI, the prescription information. And so if it's not on label, what a commercial colleague will do is they can connect the healthcare provider to an MSL. And then that's an opportunity for you to come in and discuss their question and answer with any data that you might have already within the company. So maybe there's a trial that was done and you had some kind of data that would answer their question, or escalating that question that they might have internally. So you're kind of like the boots on the ground, right? So when I say support, it could be multiple things. It could be answering a question. It could be supporting or bringing in a new idea that an investigator might have where they want to do an investigator-initiated trial. In that case, the MSL is the one who is advocating for this trial for them. They're going to be the person presenting to scientific review boards within the company. So those are two instances. And then the last one is supporting a drug or molecule in a clinical trial is oftentimes in clinical trials, if there are issues with documentation or if there are issues where there are information that we need that we are not getting from the site, the MSL might chime in as the liaison to connect with the right people at the right place at the right time.
Great. Yeah, that's very fleshed out answer of kind of how to better understand the concept of supporting. Well, that's great. And in that example that you just provided, you kind of brought up what commercial colleagues are doing in counterpart to what the MSLs are doing. And if you don't mind just kind of explaining what that partnership looks like in other capacities of how they work together and what the two goals are of an MSL versus someone on the commercial team.
Sure. I think it's the partnership is to the benefit of the patients, right? So you want to make sure that you're working with your commercial colleagues to answer questions that the healthcare provider might have so that they can best treat their patient. And so the role for an MSL in this aspect is to be non-promotional, which means that you're not, what you want to do is you want to be the scientific point person that a healthcare provider could come to and ask for questions, that you're giving them information that is relevant, that is concise, that is accurate and unbiased. Why that's important is that I think because there's a difference between, there's a compliance guardrails between commercial and MSLs. And I think that's something that's really important across the whole industry. And so there are, every company has compliance guardrails in terms of how do MSLs coordinate or communicate with their commercial colleagues. And then how information flows through from a commercial colleague to the medical science liaison so that they can answer a question that a healthcare provider might have.
Perfect. Well, it's wonderful to hear. And additionally, I think some of our audience members come from a variety of different backgrounds, including PhDs, and they might be thinking, I'm an expert in this one little niche area. How can I do these functions as a future MSL and switch over to different therapeutic areas? So if you have any tips on what that transition will look like, how does that work for a candidate who's trying to talk to a hiring manager? What is your best advice in that scenario?
I think the best experience that I had was in academia. I worked in a lab where we needed to collaborate with other labs to get things done, because reagents are expensive. I remember like coordinating with another lab so I can do a Western blot in their lab and then bring that Western blot and analyze it. Or I worked as a scientist, a fruit fly scientist. We didn't have mouse in our building or in our lab. So what we did was we had a partnership with another lab that had the capabilities. And so I would go there and do the experiments. So it was a lot of that relationship building for concerns that they might have, sharing resources, being responsible about what you're doing, planning ahead. I think those are all skills that we, in general as PhDs have, right? These are things that we have to pull anyways. On top of that, you need to have some scientific acumen that you bring to the table.
Great. Well, yes, hopefully, again, very encouraging to our PhD students and postdocs in the audience that there is a variety of transferable skills to bring to the role. Well, excellent. And I just wanted to give you the opportunity. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to mention if there were any other tips that you had for even kind of aspiring MSLs as well as early stage career MSLs about how to get started in interjecting themselves into different stages of the product lifecycle, if you had any other summary tips.
Sure. One of the things that I think is really important is to ask yourself, what are the stereotypes that you're fighting? So if you're a PhD, what are the stereotypes that you have that people have about PhDs, and how are you different from that? So I'll use myself as an example. As a PhD, I think the stereotype that people have based on like interactions with other PhDs or just watching Big Bang Theory is that PhDs are, nerdy. They get lost in the weeds. If you ask them a question, it'll take them 10 minutes to answer that question with a lot of hedging. And so for me, during the interview process, during the reaching out to people and applying, the question I was asking was that how do I demonstrate that I'm different from the stereotype that someone might have? Now, the same thing could be for a PharmD. The same thing could be for an MD. As an MD who's trying to break into an MSL role, as a PharmD who's trying to break into an MSL role, the question you want to ask yourself is, what are the stereotypes that people might have? And this is something you can gather from meeting a lot of these people on LinkedIn, doing informational interviews. You can ask them, what are some of your concerns about a PharmD breaking into this role? And once you know those stereotypes that people might have, trying to find from your experiences, both professional as well as personal, how are there events in your life that or activities that you've done that breaks that mold or that stereotype?
That's a great theme. I think hopefully everyone who's listening back to this webinar is going to take away is that there's definitely stereotypes that people have looking at the terminal degree that you have, but there's plenty of ways to kind of address that. And it takes self-reflection of understanding what those points are. So I think that's a continual process that is necessary for an MSL. So that's wonderful. Thank you so much for shedding light on exactly what the role entails, kind of how the MSL needs to function and collaborate with others. And so with that, I will stop the recording right there.